Some stories aren't about loss. They're about what survives after the loss. This is Brinicle Reads. And tonight's story is about a woman who buried her husband, only to discover he never died. This is My Husband Died, Then I Found Him Alive with Another Wife. If you've ever trusted someone completely, if you've ever loved without a backup plan, stay with me. Because this story isn't about revenge. It's about truth. The wife who buried a living man. Claire Anderson never imagined she would become a widow at 29. Widowhood, in her mind, belonged to another stage of life: gray hair, slow mornings, years of shared memories neatly packed into photo albums. Not a rented apartment in Chicago. Not a kitchen still smelling faintly of last night's pasta. Not a bed where one side stayed cold long after dawn. But grief doesn't ask permission. It arrived on a Tuesday. Claire remembered the exact time because the clock on the microwave froze at 3:17 p.m. when the power flickered, just as her phone rang. She almost ignored it. Unknown number. She was tired. She'd just come home from work, heels kicked off near the door, her laptop bag slung onto the chair like it always was. She was thinking about texting her husband, Ethan, to ask if he'd remembered to pick up milk this time. Instead, the call changed everything. A calm male voice introduced himself as a state trooper. There had been an accident. A multi-vehicle collision on I-90. One driver didn't survive. Are you Mrs. Claire Anderson? She said yes, already standing, already knowing, even before the words finished falling. The details came gently. Carefully. Like they were afraid she might shatter if spoken too loudly. Ethan's car had been found abandoned near the crash. His wallet inside. His phone destroyed. Identification confirmed. They told her they were sorry. People always say that part feels unreal, but Claire remembered it with perfect clarity. The way the wall behind her looked suddenly unfamiliar. The way her knees buckled but never quite hit the floor. The way her mouth opened to scream, but nothing came out. Shock doesn't roar. It silences. Ethan Anderson was pronounced dead without a body. A presumed fatality. That phrase followed her for years. The funeral was closed casket. His mother, Margaret Anderson, insisted. It's better this way, she said, holding Claire's hands between hers, her eyes dry but intense. You don't need to see anything disturbing. Claire nodded because nodding was easier than thinking. People filled the church, co-workers, distant relatives, neighbors who brought casseroles and condolences they'd rehearsed on the drive over. Someone hugged her too tightly. Someone else cried harder than she did. Claire stood at the front in black, staring at a wooden box that felt too small to hold a life. Her life. She wondered if this was how it ended. Not with a goodbye. Not with a final argument or an unfinished sentence. Just a space where someone used to be. Margaret stayed close. Too close. She handled the paperwork. The insurance. The death certificate. The legal forms that Claire didn't have the strength to read. Let me take care of this, Margaret said again and again. You're not thinking clearly right now. And Claire believed her. Because grief makes children of adults. The days after blurred together. Claire slept in Ethan's t-shirts. She listened to his old voicemails like they were oxygen. She stopped answering texts because she didn't know how to explain the shape of her pain. At night, she waited for the sound of keys in the door. It never came. She replayed their last conversation endlessly. He'd been distracted. Rushed. Something about traffic. Something about his mom calling again. "I'll see you tonight," he'd said. That sentence became a wound. Margaret visited often in those first months. She brought food. She organized boxes. She gently suggested Claire move some things into storage. "Clothes you won't need right now," she said softly. Claire didn't argue. She watched Ethan's life get reduced to labeled containers while she stood in the doorway, holding his jacket like it was proof he'd existed. Margaret spoke about Ethan in the past tense with alarming ease. "He always hated cold weather," she said once, smiling faintly. Claire noticed it then, the distance. The restraint. The way Margaret never cried when she thought no one was watching. But grief looks different on everyone, Claire told herself. She trusted her mother-in-law. That trust would cost her 5 years of her life. By the end of the first year, the world expected Claire to move on. Friends gently suggested dating apps. Co-workers stopped mentioning Ethan's name. Even Margaret pulled back, visiting less, calling only on holidays. Claire didn't move on. She survived. There's a difference. She lived alone. She worked. She paid bills. She smiled when required. But she didn't rearrange the furniture. Didn't replace the photo frame by the bed. She lived like someone who might need to remember everything exactly as it was. Just in case. On the 5th anniversary of Ethan's death, Claire sat alone on her couch with a glass of wine she didn't taste. She scrolled aimlessly through social media, weddings, babies, vacations, lives moving forward without asking permission. Then she saw it. A photo. A wedding photo. And a face that should not exist. 5 years of silence and survival. For 5 years, Claire Anderson lived as if time had stalled the moment Ethan disappeared. Not frozen, just muted. Life continued around her, loud and impatient, but inside her apartment, everything stayed carefully quiet. The clock ticked. The radiator hissed. The city outside kept moving, but Claire existed in a smaller world, one shaped by memory and restraint. She never called herself brave. She called herself functional. Every morning, she woke up at 6:30. She made coffee the same way Ethan liked it, too much cream, not enough sugar, though she drank it black now. Old habits lingered like ghosts. She worked in a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. Reliable. Invisible. The kind of employee managers praised for being steady. Claire liked that word. Steady meant no one asked questions. No one looked too closely. Her co-workers knew her story in fragments. Widowed. Car accident. Tragic. The details blurred over time, and Claire never corrected anyone when they got it wrong. It was easier to let the narrative fade than reopen it. Grief, she learned, didn't scream forever. Eventually, it learned to whisper. Her apartment reflected that quiet endurance. Everything was clean but not styled. Lived in but untouched. Ethan's jacket still hung behind the door, not because she needed it, but because removing it felt like erasing proof that he'd once walked through that space. At night, she sometimes reached across the bed before catching herself. 5 years was a long time to keep making the same mistake. Friends drifted away, not cruelly, just gradually. Invitations slowed. Conversations changed. Claire became the woman people were careful around, the one whose sadness felt permanent. Dating never happened. She tried once. A man named Ryan. Coffee shop. Safe conversation. He laughed easily. Asked about her life. When he asked why she'd never been married, her throat closed. She said she wasn't ready. She meant she didn't know how to explain being loyal to someone who no longer existed. Margaret Anderson stayed mostly absent during those years. A call on Ethan's birthday. A stiff card at Christmas. Polite distance wrapped in maternal concern. Claire noticed, but she didn't question it. People retreat from grief. It makes them uncomfortable. That's what she told herself. There were nights when the loneliness felt physical. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just heavy. Those nights, Claire replayed Ethan's voicemails. She knew each one by heart. "Hey, babe, it's me. Call me when you get this." She never deleted them. She never saved them elsewhere either. Something about their fragility felt honest. If they disappeared one day, maybe that would mean it was finally time to let go. 5 years after the accident, on a quiet Sunday evening, Claire poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the couch. She hadn't planned anything special. Anniversaries had lost their sharpness over time. Pain dulled, even if it never fully vanished. She opened her phone out of habit more than interest. Scroll. Scroll. Like. A former college friend's engagement. A coworker's vacation photos. A sponsored ad she ignored. Then she stopped. Her thumb froze mid-scroll. The image on her screen made no sense. It was a wedding photo. Bright. Crisp. Sunlit. A man in a tailored navy suit stood beside a smiling bride. His arm rested naturally around her waist. His posture was relaxed. Familiar. Too familiar. Claire felt the room tilt slightly, as if her body recognized something her mind refused to accept. She zoomed in. Her breath caught. The man had Ethan's face. Not similar. Not close. Exact. Same dark hair, cut shorter. Same jawline. Same small scar on his chin from the time he'd slipped on ice outside their old apartment. Claire had kissed that scar once and joked that it made him look dangerous. Her hand began to shake. She zoomed further. The smile, slightly crooked on one side. The crease near his left eye. This wasn't grief playing tricks. This was him. Alive. Her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if the neighbors could hear it. She stared at the screen, waiting for the illusion to break. For the face to morph. For logic to return. It didn't. The caption read, "Best day of my life." Tagged location, Santa Barbara, California. Tagged name, Mark Wilson. Claire whispered Ethan's name out loud, as if saying it might summon reality back into place. Nothing happened. She locked her phone and stood up too fast. The room spun. She pressed her palm against the wall until the dizziness passed. Her mind raced, grasping for explanations. A coincidence. A look-alike. A cruel joke. She reopened the photo. Scrolled through the profile. More pictures appeared. Him hiking. Him laughing. Him at a dinner party. Him holding a woman who was not Claire. 5 years of life. 5 years he wasn't supposed to have. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't a mistake. This was a second existence. Claire sank back onto the couch, phone clutched in her hand like evidence from a crime scene. Her thoughts fractured. If he's alive, then what did I bury? What did I mourn? What did I lose? Her chest tightened, not just with anger, but humiliation. The world had moved on because it believed a lie. And she had lived inside that lie for half a decade. She didn't cry. That came later. First came numbness. A cold, focused stillness that felt unfamiliar but steady. Claire did not message him. She did not comment. She did not call Margaret. Instead, she took screenshots. Every photo. Every tag. Every date. She created a folder on her laptop and named it something neutral. Documents. That night, she slept without dreams. The next morning, she called in sick for the first time in 5 years. She sat at her kitchen table with coffee gone cold and began to research. Mark Wilson. Public profiles. Wedding registry. Address. The pieces aligned too easily. Name change. New job history. Clean slate. Claire's hands shook as realization settled into something heavier than shock. This wasn't survival. This was abandonment. And someone had helped him do it. By afternoon, she had one name circling her thoughts like a vulture. Margaret. Claire opened her old emails. Found nothing. Then she remembered, Margaret had handled the paperwork. All of it. Claire leaned back in her chair, heart pounding not with grief this time, but with clarity. 5 years ago, she'd trusted without question. Now, she wouldn't confront anyone. Not yet. Because grief had taught her patience. And patience, she was beginning to realize, was power. Following the ghost. Claire did not confront the man in the photograph. That was the first decision she made that truly belonged to her. Every instinct screamed to message him. To type his name and watch the truth unravel in real time. But instinct was emotional, and emotion had already cost her 5 years. Instead, Claire chose silence. And silence, she would learn, was sharper than anger. The next few days passed in deliberate quiet. She went back to work. Answered emails. Attended meetings. Smiled at the right moments. No one noticed anything different, and that anonymity became her shield. At night, she investigated. She treated the truth like a puzzle that didn't want to be solved. Mark Wilson's online presence was clean. Too clean. The kind of life someone builds intentionally. Carefully curated photos, polite captions, no history before 5 years ago. No childhood pictures. No old friends tagging him. No messy digital trail. Claire knew marketing. She understood branding. This wasn't a life that evolved. It was a life constructed. She started with public records. Marriage licenses were public in California. It took patience, but eventually she found it. Mark Wilson and Laura Wilson. Married. 3 months ago. Claire stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Her chest tightened, not with jealousy, but disbelief. He hadn't just survived. He had replaced her. She checked death records next. Ethan Anderson. Declared deceased. No body recovered. Death certificate filed. Filed by Margaret Anderson. Claire's fingers hovered over the trackpad. That name felt different now. Heavier. She took a day off work and visited the county clerk's office where the death certificate had been issued. The building smelled like old paper and resignation. The clerk was polite, efficient, bored. Claire asked for copies. Signed where instructed. Paid the fee. She expected resistance. There was none. Because the system didn't know it had been lied to. At home, Claire laid everything out on her dining table. Marriage certificate. Death certificate. Insurance documents Margaret had once told her not to worry about. Property transfer records. The pattern formed slowly, like a bruise surfacing days after impact. Ethan's debts, quietly settled. Assets, moved, protected, redirected. Claire, excluded. Margaret had been the architect. And Ethan had been the willing participant. Claire remembered moments she'd ignored. Margaret insisting on a closed casket. Margaret discouraging questions. Margaret urging Claire to move on sooner than felt natural. It hadn't been cruelty. It had been calculation. One night, Claire found something that made her sit back in her chair and exhale slowly. A name change filing. Ethan Anderson Mark Wilson. Filed 6 months after the accident. Claire laughed once. A short, hollow sound. He hadn't even waited a year. She didn't feel rage yet. Rage came later. First came grief, reborn, sharper than before. Not grief for a dead husband, but grief for a marriage that had been erased without her consent. For vows that had only bound one of them. She'd mourned him honestly. He'd escaped her quietly. Claire booked a consultation with a civil attorney. She didn't tell the receptionist the full story. She didn't need to. She simply said she had questions about marital status and identity fraud. The attorney's name was Daniel Brooks. Mid-40s. Calm voice. Listened without interrupting. Claire laid the documents on his desk one by one. By the time she finished, Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said carefully, "this is significant." That word again. Daniel explained it plainly. If your husband faked his death, and your marriage was never legally dissolved, then you're still married. Claire swallowed. And his new marriage? Daniel didn't hesitate. Invalid. The word landed with weight. He continued. This involves fraud. Potential conspiracy. Identity falsification. And emotional damages. Especially if his mother assisted. Claire's jaw tightened. She did, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Then this isn't about revenge, he said. This is about correction. Claire liked that. Correction sounded clean. Necessary. She left the office with a folder of next steps and a strange sense of calm. For the first time in years, the ground beneath her felt solid. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining things. She wasn't stuck in the past. She was standing at the edge of the truth. That night, Claire opened her laptop and drafted an email. Not to Ethan. Not to Margaret. To Laura Wilson. The other woman. She stared at the blank screen for a long time. This part mattered. Claire didn't accuse. She didn't insult. She wrote carefully. Respectfully. She attached documents. Marriage license. Death certificate. Name change filing. She ended with one sentence. I don't blame you. But you deserve to know who you married. Then she closed the laptop. The next morning, her phone rang. Unknown number. Claire let it ring. A voicemail followed. A woman's voice, shaken, confused, real. Hi, this is Laura. I got your email. We need to talk. Claire closed her eyes. The ghost was starting to speak. The mother's sin. Claire did not rush to meet Laura. That decision mattered. Truth, she had learned, needed room to breathe before it could be trusted. Instead, Claire sat alone in her apartment and thought about Margaret Anderson, the woman who had held her hands at the funeral, who had whispered reassurance while the coffin was lowered, who had told her, "You're strong. You'll survive this." That sentence echoed differently now. Margaret lived in a quiet suburb 2 hours away. Claire hadn't visited in over a year. There was no fight, no falling out, just a gradual absence that felt natural at the time. Now, it felt intentional. Claire drove there on a gray Thursday afternoon, documents neatly stacked in her bag. She didn't rehearse what she would say. Rehearsal allowed lies to prepare. She wanted Margaret unguarded. The house looked exactly the same. Trim hedges. White siding. A porch swing that creaked gently in the wind. It was the kind of place where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. Margaret answered the door with a surprised smile that faltered half a second too late. "Claire," she said. "This is unexpected." Claire returned the smile. "So is seeing my dead husband alive," she said calmly. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was surrender. Margaret stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled like lemon cleaner and old furniture. Claire sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had once explained insurance forms with practiced patience. Margaret folded her hands. "How much do you know?" she asked. Claire placed the documents on the table. "All of it," she said. "And enough to know you helped him." Margaret closed her eyes. Not in denial. In exhaustion. She didn't argue. She didn't deny. She didn't cry. Instead, she spoke. Ethan had been drowning 5 years ago. Debt. Quiet investigations. Poor decisions layered on top of worse ones. He'd come to his mother terrified, convinced his life was over. He thought prison was inevitable, Margaret said softly. He was wrong, but fear doesn't care about facts. Margaret had always protected her son. Always cleaned up his messes. This time, she did something irreversible. She suggested disappearing. A staged death. A new name. A clean slate. It was supposed to save him, she said. Claire felt something cold settle in her chest. "And me?" she asked. Margaret looked up. "You were strong," she said. "I believe that." The sentence hit harder than any insult could have. Margaret explained how carefully it had been done. The abandoned car. The destroyed phone. The paperwork. The closed casket. Ethan had left the state that night. Margaret had stayed behind to manage the aftermath. Including Claire. "I thought," Margaret said slowly, "that if you believed he was gone, you'd eventually move on." Claire laughed once. "You watched me mourn him," she said. "For years." Margaret's voice wavered for the first time. "Yes." Claire stood. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She simply said, "You decided I was expendable." Margaret flinched. "That's not." "It is," Claire interrupted gently. "You chose your son's future over my reality." Silence swallowed the room. Margaret tried once to justify it. "He has a new life now," she said. "A wife. Stability." Claire turned back to her. "And I had a husband," she said. "You buried him while he was breathing." That ended the conversation. Claire left without another word. Outside, the air felt sharp and clean, like a storm had just passed. She sat in her car and allowed herself one deep breath. Not of relief. Of release. That evening, Claire met Laura. A small cafe. Neutral ground. Laura looked younger than Claire expected. Pale. Trembling slightly as she wrapped her hands around her cup. I didn't know, Laura said immediately. I swear. Claire believed her. She slid copies of the documents across the table. Laura stared at them, eyes filling. He told me his parents were dead, Laura whispered. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Margaret had erased more than one woman. Laura's voice broke. My marriage isn't legal, Claire said gently. But what you choose to do next, that is. Laura nodded slowly. I'm leaving, she said. I can't live inside a lie. Claire felt no triumph. Only something close to peace. 2 days later, Ethan called. Claire watched the phone ring. Then she answered. Claire, he said, voice shaking. Please. I already mourned you, she replied. This conversation is for the law. She hung up. The next week, Daniel Brooks filed the case. Fraud. Identity falsification. Conspiracy. Margaret received notice first. Then Ethan. Then the world began to close in around the lie. A marriage that never ended. The courtroom didn't look like the movies. No dramatic lighting. No shouting. No gasps from the gallery. It looked ordinary. And that, Claire realized, was exactly what made it powerful. Because ordinary rooms were where lies went to die. Claire sat beside Daniel Brooks, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a navy blazer she'd bought years earlier and never had a reason to wear, until now. Her posture was calm, her expression neutral. Ethan sat across the room. Not beside her. Not near her. Across. Under a different name. He looked smaller than she remembered. Older, too. The confidence he'd worn so easily in that wedding photo had evaporated under fluorescent lights and legal scrutiny. Margaret sat behind him. Straight-backed. Controlled. Still convinced, Claire could see, that she had done what was necessary. The judge began by stating the facts. A presumed death without a body. A name change. A second marriage. Assets transferred. Each item landed like a measured blow. Daniel stood. Your Honor, he said calmly, this case is not about punishment. It's about restoration. Claire liked that word. Restoration. The central truth emerged quickly. Claire and Ethan's marriage had never legally ended. No divorce. No annulment. No death, despite what the paperwork claimed. Under the law, Claire was still his wife. Which meant everything that followed, the name change, the remarriage, the asset concealment, rested on a lie. Laura testified briefly. She didn't cry. She simply told the truth. I believed I was marrying a single man, she said. I wasn't. The judge nodded. Her voice carried weight because it wasn't angry. It was honest. Margaret's testimony was different. She framed her actions as protection. As desperation. As maternal instinct. I did what I thought was best, she said. My son was afraid. The judge listened. Then asked one question. And did you ever consider what was best for his wife? Margaret had no answer. Silence filled the room. When Ethan spoke, it was too late. He apologized. Explained. Claimed panic. I never meant to hurt anyone, he said. Claire didn't react. She'd learned something important over the years. Intent doesn't erase impact. The ruling came swiftly. Ethan's second marriage was declared invalid. Claire was legally recognized as his spouse during the entire period. Assets transferred under false pretenses were subject to restitution. Civil damages were awarded. Margaret's involvement was formally documented. No jail. No shouting. Just consequences. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Claire declined to speak. She didn't need to explain herself to strangers. The truth was already public. Later that evening, Claire sat alone in her apartment. She removed her wedding ring. Not in anger. Not in grief. But with clarity. She placed it in a small box and closed the lid. For the first time in years, the silence felt different. Not empty. Open. She didn't take everything she was entitled to. She took what was fair. Then she walked away. Because winning didn't mean owning the past. It meant being free of it. Margaret lost more than the case. She lost her relationship with both women. Ethan lost the life he'd built on borrowed time. Claire gained something quieter. Herself. That night, she slept deeply. No ghosts. No waiting. Just rest. The woman who chose herself. When the case ended, Claire expected closure to feel louder. She thought there would be relief sharp enough to notice, like air rushing into lungs after being underwater too long. She thought the anger would finally arrive, late but furious, demanding space after years of restraint. None of that happened. Instead, something subtler unfolded. Peace didn't crash into her life. It settled. The first thing Claire did after the ruling wasn't celebratory. She went home and cleaned. Not frantically. Not obsessively. Methodically. She took down the jacket from behind the door and folded it carefully. She didn't rush. She didn't cry. She placed it in a box labeled "Past" and slid it into the closet. Not hidden. Just stored. For the first time, the apartment felt like it belonged to one person. Her. Mornings changed slowly. She woke without that instinctive reach across the bed. She stopped replaying conversations that never existed. She deleted the voicemails, not in a moment of strength, but in a moment of certainty. She didn't need proof anymore. She knew what was real. Friends noticed the shift before she did. "You look lighter," someone said at work. Claire smiled politely. She didn't explain. Some transformations didn't need witnesses. Laura emailed once. Just once. A thank you. An apology. A goodbye. Claire replied with kindness. No bitterness. No bond. Their connection had been forged in deception, but it ended in truth. That was enough. Margaret never reached out again. Claire didn't expect her to. Some silences weren't absence. They were accountability. One evening, Claire sat by her window watching the city glow. 5 years ago, she had believed love meant endurance. That staying loyal to a memory was strength. Now she understood something else. Strength was choosing reality, even when it hurt. She began volunteering with a small legal advocacy group, quietly, anonymously. Helping women navigate identity fraud, abandonment, quiet betrayals that didn't make headlines. She didn't tell her story unless asked. When she did, she told it plainly. No villains. No heroics. Just facts. People listened. Because truth spoken without bitterness is hard to ignore. Months later, Claire packed up her apartment. Not because it haunted her, but because it had served its purpose. She moved to a brighter place with larger windows. More light. On her first night there, she stood alone in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee. The city outside hummed. Her phone stayed silent. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like something was missing. She felt complete. Claire didn't forgive Ethan. Not out loud. Not ceremonially. She simply stopped carrying him. And that was enough. Some stories end with revenge. This one ended with release. Because the most powerful thing Claire ever did was choose herself. Some betrayals don't destroy you. They return you to yourself. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. This is Brinicle Reads, where quiet strength speaks the loudest. Until next time.